Good day, Thomas Jefferson Hour podcast listeners. And as always, sincerely, thank you for listening.
We're glad to have you aboard. This week, a really difficult conversation about an essential subject, which is memorials, statues, place names, etc. As you all know, the statue of Theodore Roosevelt in front of the American Museum of Natural History is coming down. Princeton is cleansing itself of at least part of its heritage to Woodrow Wilson, who was its president for a time and a professor there. A statue of Jefferson came down in Portland, Oregon. There's talk in some quarters of even demolishing the Jefferson Memorial in Washington, D.C. I know I get asked about this absolutely every day, David. I've been writing about it for governing.com. People can look at my articles and essays. I just submitted one this morning about the Roosevelt statue at the American Museum of Natural History and how a humanist, how a humanities scholar tries to process a question like this. In other words, it's not simply a judgment, take it down, keep it up. It's an attempt to evaluate how to think about this, or how at least a humanities scholar of my training would attempt to think about this. It's a huge issue, and I know that Dr. Ellis has been thinking about it too in his seclusion in Vermont, and so we wanted to have a conversation with him this week. It turned out to be, I think, a really rich one, but also for me an exhausting one, and I think for you too. It's a hard subject, and it's painful for us to try to work our way through it. And I don't think that anybody really has a monopoly on the right answer to these questions.
Well, first, I want to apologize to our listeners. This program, due to circumstances, had to be recorded remotely, so the audio suffers, and the audio engineer and me grimaces at that a little bit. So we appreciate your understanding of the circumstances, and again, our apologies for that. The program really helped me a lot to be able to listen to you and to Joseph Ellis tackle this subject.
Well, I just love having Joe Ellis as a conversationalist, because he's full of humor, good sense. There's a warmth. He's not a hothead of any sort. He's thought a lot about all these questions. He knows an enormous amount about the early national period in American history, and I think his own thinking is evolving in that cabin in the woods of Vermont. I think everyone's is. When I started thinking about Thomas Jefferson 30-some years ago, slavery was an issue, but it certainly wasn't the issue. And it has grown and grown over time until it has become overwhelming now and may sweep parts of Jefferson's legacy away. We'll have to see where this winds up, but it deserves to occupy a much greater place in Jefferson studies than it used to. The question is, can it go too far? Who gets to decide how we place slavery and race in sort of the whole man theory of Jefferson? Does it discredit everything? Does it discredit some things? Does it require an asterisk every time we think about a Jefferson achievement? And by the way, I wanted to tell you, David, I'm undertaking something that I call the Asterisk Project, and I need help. I believe and the easiest example of this is the gardens at Monticello. As you know, we have a great friend there in Pat Brodowski. At any rate, the point is that terraced garden was built by slaves. If you had that garden built with bulldozers, it would now be ruinously expensive. It's 1,000 feet long. It's carved off of the south side of the mountain. And so when I first went there and saw the beauty of that garden, I was just swept away by it. And I thought, what an incredible achievement for Thomas Jefferson. What a genius. What a whimsical man. And then when you realize, several scores of black men and women spent several years moving the earth in wheelbarrows with spades and hoes to make that possible. If you add that lens, that changes your way of seeing this. It has to. And so I'm trying to do something called the Asterisk Project, in which I go back through Jefferson's life and try to do justice to an understanding of how dependent he was in everything that he was and did on enslaved labor, not to condemn him and to insist that he's a horrible man, but to try to have a more balanced view of his achievement, to get over the kind of the children's wow factor at the wonders of Monticello, and realized that all of that was done with labor that would be illegal in our time. And if you actually had to pay for the labor, hand labor that built that terrace, it would be so expensive that it could never, under any circumstance, be afforded by Jefferson or anybody else. And so this is a really interesting project. I'm trying to wear this lens.
Yeah, that's great.
And so we'll have conversations and programs about this. But I'm glad for Joseph Ellis. And he's agreed, by the way, as you know, to come back. We're going to do a 10-part series over the next few months, going over each one of his books, beginning in 1979, his book After the Revolution, and working our way chronologically through his books on Adams and on Jefferson, on the other founding fathers, on Abigail Adams and John, on George Washington, all the way through to his most recent published work, and to try to give him a chance to reflect on his own journey as a prominent American historian through a week-by-week or month-by-month, depending on how we schedule it, rereading of his books.
Well, let's get to this week's conversation between the two of you. But before we go, I know you're off to Montana, your annual Lewis and Clark trip, and when you come back, we're going to do a debrief show so you can tell everybody about it. And you've assured me that it's going to be safe and you're taking all the correct precautions. And I wish you a good journey and all those on it a good journey as well.
Lots of masks, of course. We'll practice social distancing. We'll be in one of the most isolated places in the American West. I can't wait.
And outdoors, too.
I think it's going to be
as well, yeah.
A really extraordinary adventure this year. Just a couple of quick things. Cuba is coming up in February, so that people can go to jeffersonhour.com and sign up for that. I think with that trip, we'll be able to go. We're also going to do Monterey for our third John Steinbeck cultural tour, that one with my friend Russ Eagle. So all of that is coming, but for the moment, what I'm thinking about is floating on the wild and scenic Missouri River in the White Cliffs on a day that's, say, 85 degrees at 2 p.m., 68 degrees by 10 p.m. The sun is shining. Maybe there's a thunderstorm in the evening. We see golden eagles on the cottonwood trees next to the river. We swim our way into camp where hors d'oeuvres are waiting and our tents have been set up. If that's not sort of a utopian idea of traveling in the footsteps of Lewis and Clark, I don't know what is. It's my favorite journey of the year. I can't wait to get out there, and I will once again attempt the Wendover Death March and report back if I live.
Well, with that, I before we go to the show, I just want to remind people for more information on all these things that Clay is doing and has just talked about, go to jeffersonhour.com. And you can spend a lot of time there. It's a very deep website. There's a lot of information there. Shows are there. And also a way to help support the Jefferson Hour. As you probably know, if you've heard before, Clay and I don't take anything for this. We just do it because we love it. And the best payoff we get are emails. Some extraordinary ones are coming in these past couple of months. People who have thanked us for the show, and we really appreciate that. On the other hand, there are costs to getting the show posted, to getting it broadcast. So we do so much appreciate those of you who have chosen to support the show, and you can do that easily at jeffersonhour.com. And with that,
let's go to the show. This very important and somewhat exhausting, but I think critically important conversation with Dr. Joseph Ellis.
Good day, citizens, and welcome to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, a place to discuss American history and all things Jefferson. I'm your host, David Swenson, and joining us this week are the creator of the Thomas Jefferson Hour, the award-winning humanities scholar and author, Clay Jenkinson, along with the noted American historian, Professor Joseph Ellis. This week's conversation, due to circumstances, was recorded entirely remotely, so I beg your forgiveness and thank you for your understanding. Clay, you chose the subject for conversation this weekend. It's a difficult one.
Yes, and this is something that I so want Dr. Ellis's remarks about, his insight, because he's spent a lifetime thinking about these questions. And we're living through a really remarkable time. The killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis, Minnesota at the end of May touched off a national conversation about where we are with respect to race and the unresolved issues of American history, the legacy of slavery, the treatment of Native Americans, America's attitude towards minorities in general, statues, school names, you name it. This is a really remarkable opportunity for us to think about this. And I think everyone has an opinion, and everyone has anxiety with respect to this. I know I do. And so I thought it would be great to talk to Joe and get his insights about this.
You're right. We're in a kind of inflection point, and I think the central issue is slavery and race, and there's no person in American history that straddles that question with greater balance than Thomas Jefferson, who simultaneously wrote the magic words of American history that are really the American promise about the meaning of human equality that is the basis of the civil rights movement. And that when King went to the Lincoln Memorial to give his I Have a Dream speech, he said, I have come to collect on a promissory note written by Thomas Jefferson. That's true, but the other side of Jefferson, which we also need to encounter, is that he did not free his slaves and in his lifetime, and that he is a person who did not believe that whites and blacks could live together in a civil fashion in the same society. That's the way to start. I want to just preface it by saying that I am not at all in favor of deleting Jefferson or Lincoln from Mount Rushmore or in any way doing away with their monuments on the Mall and the tidal basin. I think attempting to erase all of American history is, from people who don't completely concur with our modern position about a biracial or multiracial society is a mistake. I think that we should draw a line between the Civil War and what it represents and what the Confederacy represented and the American Revolution and what it represents. I would be in favor of eliminating the Confederate flag from all public buildings and taking down Confederate statues, putting them in a museum, not destroying them, with signage that explains that the Civil War was, in fact, it was a war about sustaining slavery and maintaining white supremacy. It was. That's what the South thought it was fighting for. But the American Revolution is a different animal. And I hope we can talk about what kind of animal it was and why all of the prominent Virginians, Jefferson, Washington, Patrick Henry, Madison, were all slave owners, and why they failed in this important matter of slavery, but also a historical perspective on the idea of racial equality. The United States became committed to that idea and ideal in a public way for the first time in the middle of the 20th century. It's very recent. It is going to be impossible to find very many prominent American presidents or leaders who embraced that principle before Harry Truman did. So, with that as a kind of preliminary preface, let me toss it to Clay.
When I think about this, I think of a spectrum, sort of a wide spectrum, maybe 40 feet long. And at one end of the spectrum are people that we're hearing from who say, tear down nothing. It's all heritage, the heritage of this country. And it's not for us to decide at this moment, that anything should come down. That these all reflect moments in the national unfolding of our experiment, and to tear down a single statue is a form of righteous arrogance and erasure. And then on the far other end of the spectrum, we're hearing it in some very limited quarters, tear it all down. They're all schnook. Dixon is a schnook, and U.S. Grant is a schnook. Churchill needs to come down in England. There's even been an assault on the idea of Mahatma Gandhi being memorialized. And so there's a sense in the minds of a few that we might as well just do it and cleanse all of our public spaces of these figures, because no one of them is without some blemish or other. Maybe the only people that get a pass in our culture are Martin Luther King and Abraham Lincoln or Sojourner Truth.
Yeah, I think that I'm interrupting, but that's what a good conversation is, a series of, I hope, polite interruptions. And that is that the one thing I want us to avoid as a historian here is a kind of mindless presentism. These people are busy being dead. They can't defend themselves. And it's unbecoming and misguided to do our politically correct isometric exercises against the fixed object of those statues.
Fair enough.
So I begin with that.
My question for you, Joe, is I don't think you're at either end of this spectrum.
No, I'm not.
Keeping everything, and I don't think you're for erasing the public square. So every one of us who tries to be thoughtful about this and not simply succumb to an extremist position has to place yourself somewhere on the spectrum. So let's start with the easy things. What would you agree with pretty quickly must go? What are the things that would be worth removing? You said the Confederate flag, for example.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that I think's got to go in all public. I mean, a person wants to put it on his or her car and that kind of thing. They have the freedom to do that. But as a public, it is not just regarded by all African Americans as a symbol of their oppression. It really was an act of treason. The reason that no statue or portrait of Lee has ever been allowed on the campus of West Point, ever, is that he was regarded as a traitor. And I therefore think that those military garrisons and in the South mostly that have the names of Confederate officers who once served in the Union Army and thereby violated their oath to the Constitution, those should be changed. And my sense is that the military and the Joint Chiefs are ready to do that. That this is not something that they will find difficult to do. So at that end, those are easy, it seems to me.
What about Stonewall Jackson and other Confederate generals, or Robert E. Lee, for that matter? Where do you stand on those?
Well, I mean, there's that wonderful boulevard. Well, wonderful. It's a very distinctive boulevard in Richmond, Monument Boulevard, with Jackson and Lee and Jefferson Davis, and then Arthur Ashe. And I think that those each, the Virginia legislature has to think about this. But my sense is most of these are coming down. Not Arthur Ashe, but that I would hesitate about that. I mean, I think that let's put them in a museum where we can have a discussion about it. I don't want to you can't change history. You can forget it, but I don't want them to be forgotten. But I want them to be remembered for who they were and what they believed they were fighting for. That a monument doesn't just elevate, and it also can be, as let's say the Vietnam War Memorial is, or the Holocaust Museum is a place to remember something tragic, not just something celebratory. If I was president of Washington and Lee, I would be having a nervous breakdown right now, I think. But I think Lee's probably got to go. But I would listen to people who want to argue on this. I mean, I'll push it a little bit. Maybe this is where you were going to take me next, so stop me and you pose the question instead of letting me frame it. The Jefferson Memorial is a gorgeous place. When I was growing up in Northern Virginia, you could take a date to the memorial and the military bands would play and you have a free date. And I don't think we want to tear that down. I do think, and this will be controversial to some Jefferson lovers, but I think it's what I would propose, that I would add a plaque inside the memorial. There are about 6 plaques there now, but I would add one that's taken from Jefferson's autobiography, 3 sentences, 1821. Nothing is more certainly written in the book of fate than that these people are to be free. Nor is it less certain that the two races, equally free, cannot live in the same government, nature, habit, opinion has drawn indelible lines of distinction between them. That's what he thought. He could endorse Lincoln in the sense of what the end of slavery, but he could not endorse Martin Luther King. But I'd like to preserve the dialogue within the Mall and the Tidal Basin among those three. That is King, Lincoln, and Jefferson. That's the American dialogue. That's who we were. That's how we got to where we are. Okay? And it's an expansion of the meaning of Jefferson's very words, a meaning which Jefferson himself at the moment would not have been able to agree to. But that's what they, I think, have come to mean, and I'd love to believe that a reincarnated Jefferson would nod and say, yes, I see it now.
Thank you, gentlemen. We need to take a short break, but we will return in just a moment. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour this week, a conversation between the creator of the Thomas Jefferson Hour, Mr. Clay Jenkinson, and Professor Joseph Ellis on monuments and their place in American society. And I do think it's important we recognize how destructive they can be to the lives of certain Americans. And I agree with Professor Ellis that we can't afford to erase American history. And I'm concerned that getting caught up in the monument debate keeps us from debating the real issue, which is race relations in America today.
I certainly agree with you. I want to come back to the Jefferson Memorial here in a moment. But starting this way, so we laid out this spectrum, those who want nothing removed because it's all, quote unquote, our heritage, and those who are disposed to remove a great deal, perhaps more than anyone of the three of us is comfortable with. And I'm trying to talk with Dr. Joseph Ellis, our special guest, about creating a consistent philosophy or methodology of this. So here's what I think I heard you saying, Joe. First, we can distinguish between nation builders and people who committed treason, so that someone like Stonewall Jackson, whatever his excellence was in other areas as a warrior or as a strategist, he was part of the Confederacy committing treason against the United States. Some of these have gone to West Point and had sworn an oath of allegiance to the Constitution of the United States. And so it's easier to want to allow those statues to be removed because they were betraying the country that they were supposed to be protecting, whereas Jefferson and Madison and Washington and Patrick Henry and James Monroe and so on may have been highly imperfect people, but they weren't committing treason against this country or its constitutions. That's a distinction worth keeping in mind as we think about what should stay and what should be removed.
That is correct. And I'm calling attention to the recentness of our commitment to a multiracial America, that people of a certain age can remember days when that was still not possible. I think that recognizing that the full and complete assimilation of the African American and now the brown American, the Hispanic American population into the United States is going to be the task that faces the rising generation. It is alive and well and clear that that's got to happen. My presumption is there will always be a pool of racism beneath the surface of American society, that racism is like a cancer. It was planted at the founding. It was always there, really. Racism preceded slavery. It wasn't a consequence of slavery. If it was just a consequence of slavery, it would have ended when the Civil War ended slavery. We will continue, as we have with cancer, to develop treatments that make it less lethal, to eliminate the fatality, or to not eliminate, but to reduce the fatality rate, to make it less dangerous. But it's never going to go away. And I think that as we approach the year 2045, which is the year that the census makers tell us the white population in the United States will become a statistical minority, mostly because of the increase of the Hispanic population, I think we can expect to see movements from the right and demagogues from the right playing the race card, because there will be a constituency for that. And that While King said that the arc of the moral universe bends upward towards justice, the United States is not the moral universe. It's the real world. And it's going to be an incremental thing that in the wake of this Black Lives Matter movement, we should expect and will probably get an incremental step forward. But we're never going to get to the full promised land because racism will always be there. And pretending that it's like poison ivy instead of cancer, that it can be eliminated, is naive. And it runs against the grain of all of American history. James Baldwin, in Notes of a Native Son, said, we always thought that making a democracy work over a continent and a people this large was going to be very difficult. But it will be much less difficult at integrating the black population into that citizenry. And he's right about that. He was right about that.
Second question, I'm seeking a second distinction. So the first was that people like Jefferson may be deeply complicit and compromised, but they were attempting to build a nation. They weren't committing actual treason against the Constitution of the United States. So this distinguishes them, say, from Confederate Memorial. A second one is that you've heard, Joe, is that many of the Confederate memorials and statues were put up in the 1950s and 1960s as acts of deliberate defiance against the civil rights movement and attempts to intimidate the African-American population into not getting, quote unquote, uppity in the face of these social movements.
Yeah, most of them were actually put up earlier than that. They were put up in the Jim Crow era and in the early 20th century, but it was a very racist time. In a sense, what happened was the South lost the war but won the peace. And the history that was written by some very distinguished, quite well-regarded historians, essentially was a kind of gone with the wind view of the Civil War and of race and slavery. And the President of the United States, Woodrow Wilson, the only person with a PhD in American history ever elected president, he segregated the federal government. He insisted that the Supreme Court have a special screening of Birth of a Nation. That's part of our history. I don't think we want to forget that, because that's what allows us to know what we're really up against. And if we don't know that, we won't be able to move with the degree of resilience that we need.
I take it that you're okay then with the removal of a number of these statues in the South that were erected for the purpose of social intimidation or to celebrate the lost cause.
Yes, I do, because that was a lie. They're celebrating a lie.
So there's a second range. Now let's get to a harder sort of approach. I'll ask you for one more distinction. I'm guessing that you would prefer these decisions to be made by deliberative processes where all of the stakeholders are at the table rather than by an angry group of people in the street with lassos and dynamite.
Absolutely, of course, yes.
All right. So those three distinctions, I think, can help our listeners. Number one, that you should think about this in terms of what that person represented with his or her life, and was that person betraying an oath to the Constitution of the United States. Number two, we want to be aware that many of these statues were not just celebrations of an individual, but racist provocations aimed at social control and often in defiance of the social dynamics of Reconstruction or of the Civil Rights Movement. And number three, that the proper entity to make these decisions, if they're going to be made, is some sort of careful, deliberative process in which everybody, not just white architects and planners, are at the table and making these decisions on a case-by-case basis. So if that's a fair reading of you so far, Joe, and I think it is, then I want to ask you about the harder questions of this discussion. You mentioned Woodrow Wilson. So Woodrow Wilson was a racist, and not only a racist, but that he resegregated portions of the United States government that had begun to be integrated by people like Theodore Roosevelt, and that he was an open racist who made sure that there was an indoctrination policy with respect to his administration and black individuals. As you know, Princeton is agonizing over this, whether to pull his name off of certain parts of that institution, whether his statue must go. You do with someone who's extremely important, the president who took us through World War I, the president who gave us the 14 points, the president who more than anybody else was responsible for the Treaty of Versailles. What do you do with a person of Wilson's importance, a progressive in many important respects, who also has this significant stain at the center of his achievement?
Well, I think the president of Princeton has struggled with this and written on it and decided that the Woodrow Wilson School at Princeton will be renamed. But that beyond that, they're not going to at present go. I think you're right. This is a toughie. I do think it's interesting, though, because the great biographer of Wilson is a guy called Arthur Link, and I remember being assigned Link's biography, 2 or 3 volume biography of Wilson when I was in graduate school at Yale. There is not a single mention of race in there. Now I think that the whole new wave of biographies about Wilson need to be written, and probably are in the process, so that we know the full range of the man's character. And that's what we have to live with. That's what because that's who he was. But I agree with you. These are the difficult ones, and I mean, Wilson is an extremely difficult case. There are people going, you're more knowledgeable than I am about Theodore Roosevelt, but there have been people going after Roosevelt too, and his position on Mount Rushmore. Mainly because the land was Native American land that was confiscated illegally for the Mount Rushmore location. On the one hand, Roosevelt was the first person, I believe, you correct me, to have a black person for dinner at the White House. He had Booker T. Washington come in. On the other hand, again, tell me whether this quote is correct, but there's some letter in which I believe Roosevelt, this is Theodore Roosevelt, said that blacks are lacquered half monkeys. And racism is there. I mean, if you erase it, you forget, again, what you're fighting against. I mean, I really think you're right. You have anybody that takes an extreme position on this issue is in the wrong place. And if we find ourselves standing in the middle of no man's land, being raked by the crossfire of extremists on both sides, we should know we're in the right place.
I like that, and I really like your suggestion that we need new biographies, not just of Woodrow Wilson, but of course we need new biographies of Patrick Henry, new by George Washington, although yours is outstanding. We need new biographies of Thomas Jefferson, of William McKinley, of Ulysses S. Grant, of Theodore Roosevelt, you name it. The minute you put on this lens, and the lens I'm talking about, Joe, is a heightened moral sensitivity to the unresolved issues of racism in American history. If you have a discipline to put that lens on, and now you look at the life of Woodrow Wilson, or now you look at William Jennings Bryan, it's a new picture that emerges. You were literally blind to certain aspects of the life of Wilson or William Jennings Bryan until you had the discipline to put on the lens of race. And so this gives us an enormous opportunity in historiography and biography to go revisit, not necessarily to condemn, but to go back and to complete the picture in a more nuanced way, don't you think?
I do. And your greatest hero, Jefferson, is relevant in this regard because one of his most radical ideas, which Madison kept telling him he needed to get rid of, is the belief in what he called generational sovereignty. That is, each generation, no debt should be able to be passed on to generations, but each generation, he wanted to have a new constitution every 21 years. I mean, of course, that drove Madison nuts. But Jefferson recognizes much more fully and clearly than any other founder that times will change and that generations will come to understand things in ways that his own generation didn't. They're pre-Darwinian, they're pre-Mendel, they're pre-Keynes, they're pre-Freud, pre-Einstein. And he was aware of that, and he said that if to not make the adjustment is to attempt to wear the kind of coat that you wore when you were a child. So he's in favor of this kind of evolution of the meaning of his own words.
And that's why we need Jefferson in spite of everything. So let me go back to this. We're in a special edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour with the very distinguished historian, Joseph Ellis. He's been a frequent visitor on this program during this pandemic. We're thrilled by his willingness to speak with us. And this is the most difficult of topics that we have had to address. And it really came to me as I thought about this program, Joe, because of something you said months ago before this movement really took fire. And you had said that it was customary in American history to play our race card face down. More recently, and particularly since the election, we've been playing it face up. And that gives me the basis for this. So let's go to someone. Well, first of all, just a quick answer, please. If the president of Princeton and the Board of Visitors decided that Woodrow Wilson should be removed entirely from that institution, no statues, no commemorative plaques, no buildings named after him, would you be okay with that, or would you cry foul?
I would not. I would say I would go with their decision. They're closer to their alumni, to their own, and they will have very well-read and thoughtful people in the process. I wouldn't second guess them.
All right, so now let's go to Theodore Roosevelt. As you know, the American Museum of Natural History has decided recently to remove the statue of Roosevelt from in front of the building. It's a magnificent statue by James Earl Fraser, who is an extraordinary sculptor. It was put up in the 1940s. It depicts Roosevelt on horseback, but flanking him on the right side is a Native American in headdress. Other side is an African gun bearer from his famous safari in 1909 and 1910. They're both beneath Roosevelt and behind his legs in the stirrups. It's been controversial for a long time, not just recently. And now the directors and the board of the American Museum have decided to remove that statue because it depicts a colonialist, imperialist Roosevelt. How do you feel about something like that?
I understand why that statue is particularly offensive. And as you say, that's been controversial for a while. It's less about Roosevelt than it is about the decision to put those images next to him. I would say, okay, I understand and endorse their decision, but don't talk to me about removing him from Mount Rushmore. And other institutions that have his name on it, or have associations that are visible in some symbolic way, it would be difficult to persuade me to get rid of Theodore Roosevelt. I think that Theodore Roosevelt ranks in the top tier of American presidents of all time. He's right behind the big three. The big three are Washington, Lincoln, and Franklin Roosevelt. You could convince me that he might be worthy of being included there and make it into a quartet instead of a trio, because the decisions that he made in the early 20th century and the new nationalism of his presidency have moved us out of the 19th into the 20th century in the most progressive way of any president, and he really is the man who offers a preview of what his cousin Franklin Roosevelt will do. The Panama Canal. There are features of Roosevelt's life that I find offensive, like the number of animals that he killed in his life are just unbelievable, and I find that offensive to me. But if you can ever find a person in American history who is perfect, I would be thrilled to know him, because I've looked for 45 years and I've never found one.
Noted, sir. And on that note, we need to take just a short break. You are listening to a very special conversation between the creator of the Thomas Jefferson Hour, Mr. Clay Jenkinson, and the noted American historian and author, Professor Joseph Ellis. They're discussing memorials, monuments, their place in American society today. I'm hoping when we return, you'll have a chance to talk a bit more about Jefferson's character and the Jefferson Memorial. We'll be back in just a moment. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, our conversation this week between Clay Jenkinson and Professor Joseph Ellis. We took our break. Clay, I know you had some further questions about a statue of Theodore Roosevelt.
We were talking about the Roosevelt statue. I agree that that statue in front of the American Museum of Natural History should probably come down. It wasn't an easy decision for the directors of the American Museum. If they had decided the other way, let's just say that after their deliberative process, which has been a long one, they had said, Fraser is a great sculptor. This does depict one aspect of Roosevelt's life. We're going to keep it. Then let's say that because of the nature of this movement that we're seeing around us, maybe it's a revolution. What if a group of people came in the night and plucked that thing down? Jefferson himself said that before we reach perfection as a society, oceans of blood must yet be filled, and that enraged man, he used the term enraged man, is going to have to wreak some damage on our social structure because the discontentment is so deep that it has to find expression, and that we should be charitable, if possible, towards these spasms of human outrage when they come. Do you see anything in that? I mean, would you be quick to condemn, or would you largely stay silent if a group of individuals did it themselves, if an institution chose not to remove a controversial statue of that sort?
It's a toughie. If I was in charge and I was deciding to keep it up for the reasons you gave, I would also have it guarded. I would recognize that that was going to be an invitation to vandalism by people who are outraged by the decision. And therefore, I would feel that I had to protect my own decision with some sort of permanent protection. I think that the deliberative process that we've been both discussing that needs to accompany those kind of difficult choices needs to take precedence over all acts of vandalism. And not only that, but the acts of vandalism often backfire. As soon as a group of protesters came and tear that thing down, there will be right-wing people who then make the case that this is a sign that things are out of control, that this is a mob, and they will then, in racist form, denounce the people who did it. You got to worry about the backlash to the backlash.
But as a historian, I think you would say that that sort of action, if it occurred, is understandable, and that if you compare, say, property damage of this sort to the systematic oppression of real human beings in the course of American history, that you need to be careful not to jump on the bandwagon of condemnation of these things. However, personally, in your private sensibility, you may abhor them. And I think I hear you saying from earlier in the conversation.
Yeah, you're right. You're right. But what worries me is it ignites the debate and moves it past any form of deliberation. And that you're right. I mean, I would accept the decision to take it down and think it would be wise. If there's no other reason, because it would become a symbol that would end up generating responses from the extremists on both sides. And we're looking for a way to get that conversation in the middle ground that you and I are currently trying to occupy.
If it were kept up, I think you would want a plaque there saying this depicts Roosevelt.
That's right. That's right.
We no longer.
A plaque akin to the one that I mentioned for the Jefferson Memorial.
David, I think you've got some correspondence that helped to lead us to this program.
That's very true. We've received many emails from listeners asking us to talk about this, asking us to address Jefferson as a slaveholder and, as some people say, a criminal. I'm listening with fascination to the two of you talk about this, and there was one letter in particular from Jeremy Thornton, and he directed me to a column by Noah Millman, who writes for a publication called The Week, which I'm not familiar with, but I'm going to read you 2 paragraphs towards the end of this piece. The question left us by the Declaration of Independence is precisely how much power to attribute to the words themselves. Were they merely an empty promise unfulfilled, or were they also an inspiration? If we note how easily the words were ignored by their own author, we might be tempted to say, not very. If we note how many people were inspired by them to die to make men free, we might be moved to say a great deal. And if the words matter, then their authors matter too, because words do not write themselves. So, was there something about Jefferson, something about America that made such words possible? Might our hunger, our impatience, our conviction of our specialness have been the goad to the Declaration's spiritual ambition as well? If so, then it is a comic irony that this ambition has become the precious inheritance of those whom its author refused to see as kin.
I think it's a brilliant letter that was in The Week. It's a journal that my mother subscribed to and read religiously every week. I do think that, going back to our previous conversations, Joe, maybe Jefferson isn't the indispensable person of the American Revolution, but he did write the indispensable sentence. If you only could have one sentence and one only from the founding period and no other, that's the sentence that will continue to haunt us until we get it right. Maybe we never will.
But one of the ironies is that they spent a day and a half editing the text of the Declaration. They made 131 changes, revisions, and deletions. They never touched and even talked about that paragraph. They thought it was a kind of rhetorical overture, I think. And it didn't have much significance for the people who actually were making that decision for independence at that moment. The person who raises the words to visibility and significance in American history is Lincoln. And Lincoln is the man who calls this the American creed, the American promise, and uses it as the foundation for his decision to declare in the Gettysburg Address that this is a war to end slavery. It's not just a war to preserve the Union. Earlier, he had said if he could get the Union without ending slavery, he'd do it. And it's the language that became the basis of the liberal tradition in American history in the late 19th and 20th century. So it's ironic, but the people, including Jefferson himself, didn't know the significance of the words when they were actually approving or writing them. I think, though, that there's no question that this is the base, that this is the reason not to throw out the baby with the bathwater here. That the liberal tradition, if it's going to continue along the arc that Martin Luther King describes, needs Jefferson's words.
Joe, we talked prior to the show, maybe about a week ago, and you told me there was a student that had come to you with this very question, and the answer that you gave him sort of stuck with me, and that is, yeah, you can say goodbye to Jefferson, but you're going to need him at some point.
That's right. That's right. I mean, this was a person, it was a student who was very liberal student, and at Mount Holyoke College. Actually, she was at Amherst College, and I was trying to tell her, just as you say, that if you attempt to delete Jefferson from American history, the very basis on which the liberal values that we want to see marching forward are founded is the man you're erasing. And it's like a kid, who comes to view his mother or father as a failure because they haven't lived up to what he thinks they were supposed to be, gods and stuff. And it's a kind of Oedipal view, and And I think that mature opinion on this is that we can't do without Jefferson.
So, Joe, the Jefferson Memorial was built to honor Jefferson on his 200th birthday, 1743, 1843, 1943. We've come an awful long way since the 1920s and 30s in our race consciousness. Mm-hmm. Everyone will acknowledge that. Do you think today the Jefferson Memorial could be built in Washington?
It would be controversial. The reason it was built in 43 was that Roosevelt wanted to build something that would be the Democratic Party's answer to the Lincoln Memorial. And there were controversies at the time, because they got to get rid of all the some of the Japanese cherry blossom trees, and people tied themselves to the trees. And then it became involved in our views on Japan. But then the language of the Jefferson Memorial became the language that Franklin Roosevelt used for the basis for our opposition to Hitler, and then becomes the basis for our opposition to Soviet version communism during the Cold War. The rhetoric of Jefferson becomes extremely effective and useful in both of those big contests, World War II and the Cold War. So that it's really a creature of the 20th century rather than of the 18th century.
Earlier in this program, you said the statement you quoted, "Nothing is more certainly written in the book of fate than this people must and will be free, and once freed must be eternally separated," and so on. If that were chiseled on those granite walls, that Jefferson was essentially an apartheidist, I don't think you can do that, because then there's no reason to memorialize Jefferson. Don't you have to whitewash Jefferson in order to celebrate him?
No, I don't think so. I mean, that's where we might disagree. I think that we're ready for imperfect heroes. We're ready to recognize that our demigods are human beings. We're ready to recognize that the greatness of Jefferson coexists with a failure. That the embedded in the greatness of the founding, the two major failures, criminal failures. One is slavery, and the other is the removal of the Native American population. And if we recover our position as a world power and move forward, we're going to continue to have flaws. We're going to continue to have those parts of our past that are not something we're proud of to always be. We're going to have failures then too. I don't believe that you need to be a utopian in order to believe that Jefferson is a great man.
Isn't this kind of a unique time in history that the public is, as you say, we're recognizing our demigods as not being perfect?
Yeah. I mean, it is time for the American people to put away childish things.
So says St. Paul, or rather here, Dr.
You mentioned, Native Americans, which is something we haven't really even touched on. We got a couple of emails about that, and they're sort of forgotten in this movement, but their time will come.
Yeah, well, they recently got a positive Supreme Court decision on their land. Yeah, that's a big decision for them, and Washington is the one guy that looks good on this issue because he made a strenuous effort during his presidency to avoid Indian removal. Again, Jefferson's not going to look good on this score. Indian removal is embedded in the founding, even though it doesn't officially happen until Jackson's administration in 1830. It's always the assumption. And that if you want to blame anybody for Indian removal, blame ordinary American citizens who are moving across the Appalachians in quest to pursue their happiness, which means land.
Yeah.
And that's the gush that can't be stopped. It's not a government program. It's a human instinct. And they brought with them their diseases, which were like a artillery barrage that eliminated the Native American population as soon as the contact happened. And we've got to be capable of tragedy. We can't be sentimentalists. We've got to be, as I say, that this is a time for a more mature understanding of what history really has been and why we'll never escape it. This is why Faulkner is brilliant. And this is why, as I said, the earlier quotation from Baldwin is, our fiction writers can talk to us about this perhaps more effectively than our historians.
We're about out of time for this conversation this week, gentlemen, but there are many listeners who are very concerned about this, and we're looking to the two of you to make sense of it all. Clay, do you have any final thoughts?
I do. I want to make the case for Joe Ellis's book, His Excellency, about George Washington. It's one of my favorite Joseph Ellis books, and here's why it's so important. I do believe that Washington is a morally greater man than Thomas Jefferson. Not flawless, of course, but at the end of his life, and this is a point that you really worked hard to establish in your book, Joe, Washington believed that there were two things that he must attend to before dying. And one of them was what's going to happen with Native Americans in the face of the push of white settlers into the Ohio Valley and Kentucky and Tennessee and so on. That's the first question. And he did something about it. And secondly, he said, I must do something with respect to slavery. I cannot die being someone who did nothing to address this issue. And so he did the very difficult work of sort of carving out those slaves that he had the legal right to free at the time of his wife's death. Those two things mark him as different from any other figure of this era, don't they?
Yeah, I mean, among the Virginian planters, he's the only one who does it. He's under pressure to do it earlier, and you wish he had done it earlier. You wish it hadn't been done, like what he said, on the death of his wife. And when the slave population in Monticello found out that was the case, they started to talk about poisoning Martha, and therefore she freed him immediately before she died. Even Washington will disappoint you, but he comes closer to not disappointing you than any of the other founders on these two crucial issues.
Those things weighed on him in such a way that he wasn't going to die without doing something about it.
It's true, and his motives for that were moral, but they were also self-centered, because he knew that we'd be sitting here talking about him over 200 years later, and his reputation would be affected by the decision he made.
I hope this conversation has helped our listeners. I know that I wrestle with this, Joe. I have no final view of this. I go back and forth and up and down. I'm encouraged at some points and deeply distraught at others. I think every person who cares about this country is trying to figure out, how do we memorialize the past without trying to erase it, and yet accept that there are injustices that are in three dimensions?
I hope what we've done is set a zone that's a dialogue zone, a place where we can come together and listen and argue profitably and recognize that the subject at hand is not one that should be left to the extremists on each side.
A dialogue zone indeed, sir. Very good. I thank both of you, gentlemen, for what has turned out to be a very interesting and enlightening conversation this week. And we hope all of you will join us again next week for another edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
The Thomas Jefferson Hour is brought to you each week by Dakota Sky Education. The program is distributed nationally by Prairie Public. President Thomas Jefferson lived from 1743 to 1826, and this program presents his views. President Jefferson is portrayed by the award-winning humanities scholar and author Clay S. Jenkinson. To obtain a copy of this or any show for a $12 donation, please call 701-575-0727. This program is also available online at jeffersonhour.com and on Apple Podcasts. If you'd like to correspond with President Jefferson or submit a question for him to answer on the program, please visit the website at jeffersonhour.com. The Thomas Jefferson Hour is produced at Makoche Recording Studios in Bismarck, North Dakota. Bach Cello Suite No. 3 in C Major by Stephen Swinford. Thank you for listening. Please tune in again next week for another thought-provoking, historically accurate program through the eyes of Thomas Jefferson.